Hello. I'm Maren Peters, the moderator of this panel tonight. Welcome to all of you. I just have to get used to be here on the stage in the middle. May I introduce my panelists? Could you please come on the stage? Yes, all of you, please. Take a seat. So, I'm very proud to have you here. May I just introduce you at the very beginning? We have Gary Hooser, who's a politician and activist, on your right or on your left, who came over the long way from Hawaii. He served as Hawaii State Senator for a couple of years and was also director of the Office of Environmental Quality Control. Actually, he's still a member of the County Council. No? Okay. And he's heading the Hawaii Alliance for Progressive Action, which urges towards a better protection of the people in Hawaii. Welcome, Gary. Next to him, we have Hank Campbell, the president of the American Council on Science and Health. That's an organization that probably not many of you do know. It aims to support an evidence-based science. The Council defends pesticides and has a reputation of being pro-industry. I might add that Hank was suggested by Syngenta, who decided just 5 days ago not to send a representative tonight. Welcome, Hank. On my left, we have Laurent Gaberell from Geneva. He's an expert in agriculture and biodiversity and represents the Swiss NGO Public Eye, who is co-host of this event, this panel tonight. Welcome, Laurent. And very good. And then we have Baskut Tuncak. He is the UN Special Rapporteur. Please allow the short form for human rights and hazardous substances, including pesticides, with a background as attorney and chemist, so he knows exactly what he's talking about, like the others as well. Welcome to all of you. Some of you might know Hawaii as a tourism hotspot with beautiful beaches, with nice water, a nice climate. We just saw the dark side of this paradise. It's also a film about power and politics and the dangerous consequences of putting corporate interests ahead of public health. I think we have a lot to discuss tonight on this panel, and we'll just get inside the discussion. Just give me a short outline. We have about an hour to discuss here on the panel, and then we'll have half an hour for your questions, and I can imagine there will be a lot of questions tonight. So let's get started. Gary Hooser, because you came the longest way, because you have been a resident in Hawaii for more than 40 years, when you saw this documentary, do you think it gives a realistic picture of what's going on in Hawaii?
Yes, thank you. And I want to thank everybody for being here and sticking around for the questions also. Yes, it very much gives a realistic view of what happened in Hawaii. I've been involved in politics at the state senate and at the county council for about 18 years, and this was the most significant action involvement I've been involved in, and I've been involved in lots of things. And I want to say, if I could, those marches, we have a community of 68,000 people. So to get 4,000 to 6,000 people to show up at a march, imagine that. And this all started with 4 or 5 people in a living room. It literally, some of those people are on the screen tonight, 4 or 5 people in the living room who came to me as a politician and said, Gary, can you help? And then we started talking about it and expressing our concerns. You know, imagine if you lived in a place like your city was surrounded by GE test fields. And imagine if people in your community started getting sick and having doctors, like the doctors who would call me and say, Gary, we think we have 10 times the rate of birth defects in our hospital. We don't know why. We're not sure if this is a random cluster, but we're concerned about this. We had 30,000 sea urchins die in the ocean. So imagine if you drove by these fields every day, and then you ask them basic questions. What are you doing? And they won't tell you. And then when you pass a law, they sue you, and they still don't tell you. That's what we're faced with right now, and there's lots of going on. There's a lot of optimistic things actually going on too, but it is an epic battle.
Gary, we'll talk about that later,
Yes,
please.
thank you.
We have other panelists that would probably might like to add to this discussion. Baskut Tuncak, you told me before you've only been once to Hawaii as a tourist. Were you shocked when you saw this film for the first time?
Absolutely. It's shocking, it's outrageous in many ways. It's very inspiring as well to see the community mobilizing and speaking so clearly about what comes across beautifully, I think, in the movie as a human rights issue. Yes. I never would have imagined that this was present in Hawaii.
How about you, Hank Campbell, with a pro-science view?
Sure. I mean, I support marches. I support insurrection. If you have a blacklist, I want to be on it. But from a science point of view, there's and it's an entertaining film. It accomplishes exactly what they're setting out to accomplish. But from a science point of view, and as Maren said, my job is to separate health threats from manufactured health scares. Things by trial lawyers, things by people who want to sue, and there is almost nothing in this movie that is scientifically accurate.
We'll come to that later, and I think that because it will be due to discussion. Hawaii is an ideal place for the GMO seed industry. That's what we learned in the film. It has a perfect climate that allows 3 yields a year instead of one, like here in Switzerland. Is that the main reason why the industry likes Hawaii so much, Gary Hooser?
They like Hawaii so much is because we're isolated, and we have a year-round growing season. So they can grow 3 crops instead of just 1 crop. There's no winter. And we have a very lax regulatory environment. And the community that they're impacting is a relatively low-income, hardworking, blue-collar, mostly Native Hawaiians. This would never happen in a more affluent neighborhood. It would never happen in communities where people have more wealth.
Hawaii, as we learned, is a big test area for genetically modified seeds and also for pesticides. Laurent Gaberell, do GMO or genetically modified organisms and pesticides always go hand in hand?
Well, I think that was mentioned in the movie that most of the GMO currently used today and also tested in Hawaii are for herbicide resistance. So it's GMOs that are really engineered to accept huge volumes of pesticides that you can apply it without killing the plants, but killing everything else. There's also BT GMOs, which is some other type of GMOs, which is actually you engineer the plant so that it itself converts in a pesticide production plant. So yes, there was this idea that GMOs would lead to a reduction in pesticides use, but now it is proven not to be the case. Mm-hmm.
As we learned from the film, a lot of pesticides are implied, also pesticides like paraquat that are forbidden in Switzerland, for instance, and a lot of other parts of the world. Is it illegal to use pesticides like this, Gary?
Where I live, atrazine, for example, is used by the ton, and you cannot use it in your country. Chlorpyrifos, the same. They use it over and over again. That was featured, and you cannot use that in Switzerland. Paraquat is the same. You cannot use it in Switzerland. Syngenta is a Swiss-based company using tons and tons of poisons that they're not allowed by law to use in their own country. And they're using it daily in my country, and in my city, and in the town and the community that I live in.
The companies normally argue that these pesticides are safe. We would have liked to ask a representative of Syngenta if they are really safe. Now we have you here on the forum, Hank. What would you say? Are they really safe if they are forbidden in one part of the world and allowed in the other one?
Yeah, I promise not to use much jargon, but I have to clarify something. There are different toxicity levels of pesticides. So chlorpyrifos is considered moderately toxic. Glyphosate is not considered very toxic at all.
It depends on who you're asking. What are you referring to? What are you referring to?
Of glyphosate?
Yes.
The pesticide?
And the others? No.
So you have an LD50. You have a lethal dose in an animal model that you use, which is how you determine toxicity. So, and you have to quantify that a little bit. For example, if we don't allow people to take pure caffeine, you can drink coffee, but you can't have pure caffeine because the LD50 of that is 45 times as high as something like glyphosate, and yet we don't ban coffee. So copper sulfate, for example, is considered moderately toxic, just like paraquat, just like atrazine, and yet every organic farmer uses this pesticide. So if we just talk about toxicity, we're not really telling an accurate science story because we're lumping in a lot of products that we know are not really harmful. I would not tell you to stop buying organic food because it uses copper sulfate, even though they use it by the ton.
Do you share the view, Laurent? As an expert on agriculture?
Of course, one of the major issues we have now is that some pesticides are banned in some parts of the world because they consider too toxic there. But in some other parts of the world, they're still allowed to be used. And there is no concerted efforts or convention to deal with this issue of about double standards. So in fact, you could have the US EPA allowing atrazine to be used because they consider it not to be too dangerous, but then it's banned in Europe. You have the same with paraquat. So we have a major issue here that when some government decide to ban some pesticides because it's too dangerous, how come there is no regulation or discussion at the international level to harmonize this? And of course, this issue about safety of pesticides is always what comes up with discussion with the industry. Today, I think we have more than 10,000 pesticides product in the world being used, and over 3 million tons of pesticides applied every year on the planet. And many of those we actually really don't know what happened because part of those have never been tested. In the US, for example, they found out that 50% of the 6,000 toxic chemicals that are being used, not only pesticides, but also in the industry, have not been tested for the 6 toxicity tests that they're supposed to be. So a lot of this has never been tested because...
But why not? What's the explanation for that?
Well,
because a lot of people might wonder about.
Partly because they were on the market, and then we adopted new regulations, and they will get tested sometime, but it didn't happen so far because of the time it takes to renew the registration. So, for example, in Europe as well, with the 2009 new regulation, now we took off, I think, 40% of the pesticides out of the market because of that, but you have still a lot of them that have been recognized as carcinogenic or endocrine disruptors or toxic for reproduction that are still on the market because you basically wait till the moment that the authorization expires to take them out of the market, and this can take a very long time because there is many delays in reviewing those pesticides.
Meaning that once they're on the market, you can't really change a lot.
You can do it, but when the authorization expires, which means after 10, 20 years, if the legal timeline is respected, and in many times you have delays, which means that it's postponed and so on and so on. And the reality today is that, and that's what I liked also with the movie, is that it gives you a sense that in fact, not only in Hawaii, but in all around the world, we're guinea pigs. We're exposed to dozens and tons of pesticides. We find pesticides now everywhere. We find it in our food, we find it in our water, we find it in our bodies, in the hairs of the children, in the breast milk that mother gives to their children. We find it in the rain as well. In the rain, we find a lot of pesticides in the air that we breathe. Everywhere. And
meaning
basically
that Hawaii is not a unique example.
It's extreme in some respect because it's a small island, and you see that the level of and the amounts that they're using there, it's really much higher than the national average, but it also shows you many similarities with what we're all experiencing now.
You say we are all guinea pigs of the industry. Tashkut, as a representative of a global institution here, do you share this view?
Well, absolutely. I think the situation is actually even more complex than pesticides. We're also exposed to air pollutants, we're exposed to industrial chemicals, and tests continue to uncover various ways in which these different mixtures of chemicals interact in our bodies. They not only interact with ourselves, but they can interact with our children. There are various chemicals that have been shown to have transgenerational impacts. Increasingly, we're seeing that these impacts carry on not just from the generation that it's exposed, but even to the grandchildren of those who were originally exposed. I think the overwhelming science is there that we need to minimize exposure to the maximum extent possible. There's really, in my view, no question about that. We can't continue to pretend that we can adequately estimate the amount that our bodies can tolerate without having an adverse health impact. And yet that's the model we largely have. When we look at toxic chemicals overall, whether it's from air pollution, from pesticides, or from industrial chemicals.
If the proof is there, the scientific proof, there is a relation between a pesticide, heavy pesticide exposure and health problems, why are so many very toxic substances are still on the market? Why is it so hard to ban them? Any explanation?
Well, I think there are many different cases and they all turn on different facts. But overwhelmingly, it's increasingly difficult to make a causal linkage between an exposure and an adverse health outcome. We know that there are risks, we know that there are associations, but the burden of proof is so great that communities, individual victims are unable to overcome that burden of proof in order to get access to justice and access to remedies, including non-repetition, avoiding the repeat of past mistakes.
From the Hawaii perspective, is there anything you can add?
Yes, I'd like to add, first of all, that with chlorpyrifos, there is no safe amount for a fetus. The research is clear. The American Academy of Pediatrics has come to that conclusion. There are many, many studies that have come to that conclusion for that specific pesticide. First, being involved with this industry, when I started asking questions, there were two big lies that I was told over and over again. One is we're feeding the world, and you need this stuff to feed the world. And that's absolutely not the case. And the other is pesticides are safe. My response was, if they're safe, why aren't you telling us what you're doing? Why are you hiding this information if they're safe? There are no shortage of studies proving that they're harmful. They kill. Sides means kills. Algicides, fungicides, pesticides. And the reason why government is not cracked down more on them was said in the film. It's about money and it's about influence, political influence and money. In my community, these companies are the largest contributor to local schools, local youth programs. They have a Syngenta employee sits on the Kauai County Council. Okay, that's the body that I used to sit on. A voting member of 7 members of the council is now a Hartung employee, a former Syngenta employee. Do you think he is going to regulate the company? No. The manager of the pesticide branch for the state of Hawaii is a former DuPont employee. This is in Hawaii, and you saw what was said about Washington, D.C. The influence is immense. The only way it will change is what you saw on there also, was people mobilize in the streets, in the signs, and political pressure on these people.
So meaning the links are just too close?
Yes, absolutely too close. Mm-hmm. They dominate the conversation. They have marketing firms, that's their job, to frame the narrative and to tell people it's safe when it's not safe. They'll ask me, if I could just real quickly, when I first got involved, they'll say, well, we followed the label. And then I was smart enough to read the label. Some of these labels are 100 pages long. And they have skull and crossbones on them, and they have a long list of things that are bad things that happen if they're used improperly. Syngenta sent 12 of their employees to the hospital on my island. The EPA was going to fine them $4.8 million until Trump administration changed the leadership and they reduced the fine. They sent 12 workers with chlorpyrifos to the hospital for misuse, and so you cannot say these things are safe. I'm sorry if I'm a little passionate about this, but my community, thank you very much. Thank you.
Hank Campbell, would you agree that chlorpyrifos is not safe?
I think it's absolutely safe. I have two things that
What's your evidence?
That it's safe.
Yes.
We have 50 years of studies showing that some of these things have to be properly used, right?
Where are these studies? Because these studies, most of them are not published. So where's the evidence?
No,
if they are so safe, why does the industry not publish these scientific studies?
There's a difference. I can only speak for the United States on how these regulations are done, right? We do not produce a product in the United States onto the market and then tell the American taxpayers, you have to pay to prove it is safe. The EPA creates a set of rules, guidelines, standards, and says, okay, you have to satisfy these criteria in your studies. You have to do them in 2 different labs. Sometimes these tests are done at a lab in Europe under the exact same conditions, and they both have to agree. So they have to be reproducible, they have to be replicable in order for these products to be approved in the first place or re-registered. Chlorpyrifos, there is no scientific study showing that it is harmful when properly used. There is one epidemiology study that linked chlorpyrifos to harmful outcomes. And I need to draw the distinction between an epidemiology study, which is a statistical inference, and a science study, which is where you're able to show harm. And they get this wrong in the movie too, because there's this one fMRI brain scan where they're saying, in the presence of this pesticide, these children's brains, if you were thinking about that scientifically, you would say, they experimented on children? They fed these children these pesticides and monitored their brain? Of course they didn't. They found people who had traces of things, and then they took snapshots of their brain, and they inferred that there was a difference. I do agree about framing. I don't like marketing any better than the rest of you do. But if we're thinking about framing, let's think about this movie. I mean, this is a movie that was clearly created by lawyers. They don't disclose in the beginning that all of the people who just say resident, they say farmer, they're all litigants against these companies. They are suing these companies for money. It's true.
The companies that was mentioned, they would have had the chance to participate in this film, but they denied to give a comment. They denied to participate. So.
Oh, I can't comment on why a company would choose not to participate.
It's just a fact.
Sure, and I have no issue with that. I'm talking really about how we want to make an evidence-based decision. I'm fine with banning lots of things. I was behind the ban on methyl bromide. It is now a restricted use chemical, whereas 25 years ago, because it's found in nature so much, we didn't really have the testing to be able to be sure. But in hindsight, we came out and said this is something that should be restricted use. Whereas glyphosate, we say this is harmless. And that's based on the weight of evidence. If it changes 10 years from now, I would happily switch too. But these are products that have been around for a long time.
They've been around for a long time, yes, but is that really a proof that they are safe? Laurent Gaberell, I can imagine that you have a different point of view.
I would like to respond, but first, one thing. Well, when you say you represent science here, and you accuse the people in the movie of not disclosing their interests, I would like that you do the same, no? You disclose as well who you're working for, because, yeah.
You're not really going to do that.
Oh, now we have a special performance here.
I work for the
What's going on, Hank?
I have I appear on a lot of panels, and these panels are always going to be a certain passionate group who don't necessarily agree with science the way that scientists agree with science. So I remove a piece of clothing every time that someone suggests that I must be a corporate shill because I'm defending the science behind these products. I'm 52 years old. You do not want to see me naked, so please keep it civil. We're funded by foundations. We're funded by individuals like you. I would encourage you all to send the American Council on Science and Health a check and then demand that I write whatever you want me to write. I mean, that's the
So
ultimate.
did I get that right? Are there no financial links to companies like Syngenta, Monsanto, or BASF or Bayer?
No, I have no conflicts. I'm happy if anybody from Syngenta is here, please send us a check. It won't change anything about what we write, but I will happily, we're a nonprofit. We will accept money from anybody except tobacco companies because we have been against smoking for 40 years. But that is the only instance where we would say we simply will not cash a check. I'm happy to take a check from any corporation, a politician, lawyers, and anybody who wants to send one.
There is a American publication, Mother Jones, that revealed secret documents.
It's that one. You know that document, right?
Sure.
This is your internal financial update from 2013.
Right.
And then when I open it and I look at where you get your money from, you get nearly $500,000 from Chevron, Coca-Cola, Bristol, Bayer, Procter, Syngenta, McDonald's. Then you have, in terms of the potential source, from previous donors, you list CropLife, Pepsi, Monsanto, British American Tobacco, Dow Agro, Exxon, Mobil, Philip Morris, BASF, Merck, and so on and so on.
A long list. Do you still stick to the statement that you're independent from industry?
And also that one, I don't know if you know that document. It's quite interesting. It's from litigation on atrazine in the US. It's an internal Syngenta document. It's called Supportive Third-Party Stakeholder Database. You know that?
Okay, I'm waiting for you to get to the point so I can respond.
Okay, so you're listed here as one of their supportive third-party stakeholders.
They listed me as a supportive.
Exactly.
Hank Campbell.
You must be happy.
I would be very happy.
Just to repeat my question, do you still stick to the statement that you are totally independent from the industry, from companies like Syngenta
Absolutely.
or Monsanto?
And it wouldn't matter anyway. But here's the point.
Why wouldn't it matter?
I arrived at the American Council on Science and Health in 2015. And the first thing I did when I walked in was to say, where is all the corporate money? Because I had read the same Mother Jones. And I encourage all of you to Google the American Council on Science and Health and look at the front page, and you will know why you should not trust this film. It's been paid for by attorneys.
Excuse me, I didn't get an answer to my question.
Let's go back.
I'll be happy to repeat it for the third time. Do you still stick to the statement that you're totally independent of these companies that I mentioned in the film?
Yes. As I said, this was in 2013, and there's a difference between a request document and actual funding. Go ahead.
Then I have a third document for you.
I told you, I've been to these talks. This happens every single time. Go ahead.
So this one is from 2015. It's an email by Syngenta, or it's an email by one of your colleagues writing Syngenta on atrazine, saying, "Dear Syngenta friends, we're happy to develop a study for you on atrazine. It will cost you $100,000, and that will be extra." Plus the money that you regularly contribute to our own work. So I have also this document for you if you want.
We did not get $100,000. I mean, I don't know how many. I'm going to have to keep taking off clothes. I want to talk about a movie, and we can talk about me. I'm here anyway. And yet I think we're doing a disservice to the audience to claim that by defending science, I'm a shill for Syngenta.
I think some of us may probably not have understood why you're taking off your clothes, what that shall prove. But anyway, Gary Hooser, you'd like to add something?
Yes, I want to it's difficult to sit here when the truth is not told. And thank you. The people in the film, the people that are primarily financing the film, Keeley and Pierce Brosnan, are not attorneys. And to my knowledge, they are not suing anybody. That's the main producers, the main funders of this film. I, however, an organization I am involved with is suing Syngenta and the state of Hawaii. But there was no money involved in that lawsuit. And that lawsuit just started a year ago, way after the film was pretty much done. That lawsuit is to force Syngenta to comply with our environmental laws. It's not for money, it's for environmental compliance. I know personally just about every person that was featured in that film. And I will say without question, none of them, the Center for Food Safety, was one, but all of those residents, none of them are gaining any financial money or lawsuits whatsoever. And so that's absolutely not a true statement to say everyone involved in this film is there because they're lawyers and they're paid for it. Thank you.
Laurent.
Because I wanted to respond to your previous question about why all those pesticides are still on the market. And what industry keeps saying when you show the data that glyphosate in 80% of the food, pesticide in the water, blah, 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 they always say that, in fact, it's below the legal limits. And that at this level, you have nothing to fear because, in fact, the level where you see adverse health effects, it's much higher. And in Switzerland, they found glyphosate in beer, in pasta, in everywhere, but they were saying that you would need to eat 70 kilos of pasta a day to suffer any danger because of this. And in fact, that's part of the problem, because what they do is that we define a limit that is safe, that you can take every day. But who defines the limit? It's basically based on toxicity studies that the industry is doing, based on guidelines that the industry helped develop. Then all those studies are submitted to member states, in Europe at least, and the member state is supposed to review all the studies, see if there is any gaps. We have seen with the Monsanto case that, in fact, they basically copy-paste everything. Then the people that, from the member states that supervise this process, they're always linked also with industry. It was the case in the glyphosate case. Then they're also supposed to look at studies in the public literature. But at the end of the day, they do not consider them at all to fix this safe limit, because it was shown, for example, recently by Pan Europe. They reviewed 7 new risk assessments for pesticides. They found 500 studies showing adverse health effects from this public literature. Then they found that in the dossier that was submitted by an industry, they had only identified 25%. Okay? And then when they looked at the assessment that was done, they found out that not a single one study was considered reliable or solid enough to be taken into account when fixing the limits. So at the end of the day, it's industry studies that are used to fix the limits.
Would you say there are no independent studies around on pesticides?
Oh, there are several, many independent studies, but they're not being considered in the risk assessment process. For example, atrazine in the US, they had all this controversy about whether it affects amphibians, because there was this study that Syngenta funded that found that at very low level of atrazine, you get male frogs turned into females. And then Syngenta just stopped the work, forbid the scientists to publish its work. But the scientist, which is called Tyrone Hayes, at the end published its own study. And there were, in fact, 75 studies, I think, on amphibians and the effect of atrazine. And at the end of the day, they based their decision on only one single study, which was the Syngenta-funded study.
Meaning as a consequence that there are no decisions that are really that can really rely on neutral scientific studies.
Few, very few. There is a huge collusion, and I think that was shown in the movie. There is a huge collusion now. It's not the only problem. It's not the only problem. There is also the problem of the cocktail effect. That in fact you say, okay, it's safe to have this amount of glyphosate, but then in fact you're exposed to dozens of pesticides from every sources, so that is not at all taken into account. Also, they do not test at all for the chronic effects of all the other products that come with the pesticide. They do not target in any way vulnerable people. We've seen that babies or the unborn child are vulnerable, but in the toxicity test, they do not take at all into account. They test on rats and on mice because they do not test on humans. but they do not consider for this level of safety, they do not take at all into account all the data, for example, on amphibians, because it's only on mammals to fix the limits. So, you know, a rat, he's living 2 years. They test on adult rats. They give it some levels on 2 years. Then they see the level, the amount that show no effects on the rats, and they decide that this is the level that is safe for a human, but applying a kind of safety factor of 100, because in fact we don't know at all what is the difference between a rat and a human.
Meaning, in other words, that there's a lot of space to manipulate these studies. Sorry? Which means that there is a lot of space to manipulate, to influence these studies from one or the other side.
Of course, and my last point, one major flaw also is that endocrine disruption. We came to realize that, in fact, some chemicals have not this linear dose effect. So, in fact, they have this U curve. So you test at high dose, you found the dose with no effects, and you assume that below that there is no effect at all. But some pesticides like atrazine or other endocrine disruptors, the effects start rising again at lower doses, and this is so because the organism and the endocrine, the hormonal system in our body works at very low dose, and that is not taken at all into account. So in fact, when they declare that the level of glyphosate that we are exposed to in our pasta, in our beer, has never been tested in rates even.
Baskut Tuncak, in your report to the Human Rights Council last year, you warned of catastrophic impacts of pesticides on the environment, on human health and the society as a whole, including an estimated 200,000 deaths a year from acute poisoning. Where did you get the evidence from?
Well, we looked at the literature, peer-reviewed literature, and we took that figure from the most reliable study that we could find about acute poisonings globally. And it was, I think, 190,000 acute poisonings that were estimated. We actually received a response from CropLife International. That's the trade association that represents Monsanto, Bayer, and all these other pesticide companies. And they pointed out an interesting fact in their response to us, which is that FAO actually doesn't monitor acute poisonings. They don't actually know. They contested the validity of that figure because it was outdated, they said, but we actually don't know how many people are dying from acute poisonings, and from chronic health effects, the numbers are simply staggering. I mean, but I just wanted to maybe reflect on two things that Laurent said. First, about endocrine disruptors, what I found was very telling was within the European debate on endocrine disrupting chemicals. These are the chemicals that interfere with the normal functioning of our hormone systems. The European Crop Protection Agency, the analog of CropLife for Europe, came out and said that if the European Commission applied the criteria that were developed by the DG Environment to restrict the use of these chemicals, 40% of pesticides would be taken off the European market from that point. I think that was 2012 or 2013. So that means that 40% of pesticides that are on the market, industry believes, are interfering with the normal functioning of hormone systems of developing children. And yet, when we published our report to the Human Rights Council last year, one of the first things that CropLife and other industry groups say to us is there are no health effects. There is no evidence of an association between X disease and Y disease and pesticides.
What did you respond to them?
We actually haven't responded, to be honest.
Why not?
I mean, where do you go from there? It's like trying to have a conversation with a climate denier, or a climate skeptic. I mean, come on, like, to say that there are no health effects of pesticides is outrageous. I mean, I'm sorry, but we have moved so far in our understanding in the myriad of ways that pesticides affect our development, that to say that is in a way an abuse of human rights, I would argue. So, can I just say one more thing if I have time? Thank you for mentioning Tyrone Hayes. because I think his case is very important to pay attention to. So Tyrone Hayes was the scientist that was working at Syngenta that discovered all these adverse effects that could result from atrazine exposure on amphibians. He was pushed out of his job. He was discredited publicly by Syngenta. And I feel that we as a human rights community need to draw greater and greater appreciation and awareness of what scientists are doing to defend and protect human rights. Today, there's an unprecedented attack on science, and this is an attack on scientists, and vis-a-vis, it's an attack on our human rights. And I strongly would encourage anyone here who feels that they have the opportunity to articulate that scientists are human rights defenders, and we should embrace them and respect them to the extent that we respect attorneys, to the extent that we respect judges. They are on the front lines of defending our right to a healthy environment. So.
Just a question on that. I think you have to elaborate a bit on the link between human rights and scientists, or human rights and pesticides. Where's the link? What human rights could be touched?
Well, you could almost go through any human rights treaty and pull out dozens. It's unbelievable how many human rights are implicated. You have to start with the right to information. When we uncover the impacts of these pesticides, we're drawing links to the right to life, the right to health, the right to safe food, safe water, adequate housing for those that are living in communities that are suffering from pesticide drift. In addition to that, there are other rights that are implicated, the rights of workers, the rights of the child. Actually, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, in my opinion, is one of the strongest international agreements to address the myriad of different pesticides that are out there, because the treaties that we have for toxic chemicals only cover the narrowest sliver of toxic chemicals that are on the market, toxic pesticides that are on the market. But in addition, there's the right to not be subject to scientific experimentation without consent. And this right has far and away been underutilized by environmental movements, by farm workers, and other movements in terms of respecting human rights from exposure. Every day we're exposed to some degree to toxic chemicals, and this stands, by and large, to the very good points made by Laurent, a violation of our right not to be subject to experimentation without consent.
If these human rights are touched, and you named a lot of human rights, why can't people from Hawaii, for instance, can't go to court and sue companies for injuring or for violating their human rights? You tried it probably.
There are many court cases in court now, not specifically on the human rights aspect, I think. Paul Achitoff of Earth Justice was in the movie, and he talked about an action targeting, it's not really a lawsuit, I believe it's an EPA administrative filing, that these companies are targeting people of color, low-income people, Native Hawaiians. So it's a civil right kind of case. There are many other cases. We have lawsuits about birth defects, lawsuits about cancer, our lawsuit about environmental quality. When you talk about rights, I think about Malia Chun. Malia Chun is a Hawaiian woman with 2 daughters, and she lives across the street from the fields. And I would say Malia has the right to breathe air that doesn't have pesticide drift in it. Every time, they don't test a lot where I live. The government resists testing, the companies won't tell us what they're doing, so what do you test anyway? But every time they test, they find evidence of pesticide drift. They find it in streams, they find it at the drinking fountain at the school, they find it in Malia's children's hair, they always find it, and the industry will say, well, it's only a small amount, it's all good. And we say, well, it's not supposed to be there. And small amounts over Malia Chun and her family for 20 or 30 years, there are adverse medical impacts of certainty. There's no question about this. You can look at Columbia University, Google that, and chlorpyrifos or Berkeley or any number. There's no shortage of studies that say chronic impacts, and it is a human right to be able to breathe clean air and drink clean water, in my opinion. Thank you.
Anything you'd like to add?
I can't imagine anybody's against clean air. So it feels like some of these things are straw men, right? We heard this puff piece on Tyrone Hayes. Yes, he published a paper and he was discredited because his paper caused the EPA to do a special emergency hearing on this product, and his study could not be used because he refused to show his data. He made a claim, he took some screenshots, he had it published in a journal, he got a friend of his in the National Academy of Sciences in the US, under an agreement that they had, a courtesy agreement, he could bypass peer review and get this published. And when the EPA said, this is very provocative. If you don't know what that means when we talk about this, and male frogs make a certain noise, right? And his study claimed that these male frogs were making less of a warble for mating, so they were becoming more feminized. This was incredibly provocative. I mean, this really did shock America to find this out, because frogs are an indicator species. We feel they are vitally important if we're looking for this slippery slope to disaster. The EPA went to Professor Hayes. I know him, I live in California. They went to him and said, please give us your data because we need to use this. He refused to show it. The data does not exist. He was discredited rightly. So to have him invoked as some sort of beacon of human rights and say he was oppressed because he was discredited because it was bad science. And it set off a whole chain of events where this product that you're talking about is called atrazine, right? It was already in re-registration at the time. They called a special emergency panel. It was re-registered because the EPA found it safe. Then they called another emergency panel in 2010 because politics. This is more politics than science at this point. Administrations change, EPA people change, and they wanted to find out if this is accurate. So, I want to caution you. I'm emotional too. I grew up on an organic farm, right, in Pennsylvania. I worked for a prominent environmental group in America called the Public Interest Research Group 30 years ago. My family has lived in the same valley in Pennsylvania since 1720. If I really thought these products were harmful, my nephews, my children, I'm a sportsman, I go every year to visit this family homestead, we go as a family together, this would be horrifying to me because I want my grandchildren to enjoy nature the same way that I enjoy it right now. And I think that I get it, if you defend science, you're a corporate shill and all this stuff, but let's ban the products that we find really are harmful and not just provide lawsuit bait for every product that's out there, because we can push zero almost out to infinity now. 50 years ago, 1 part per million was considered zero. We couldn't detect beyond that. Now we can detect 1 part per quadrillion. That's 1 drop in 250 Olympic-sized swimming pools. It can't.
How about the fact that these pesticides do not come alone normally? I mean, you can give the example of Hawaii, of course. There are a lot of pesticides on the fields. You don't even know what pesticides are there, what are used jointly. You try to get information, but you did not succeed.
Thank you for reminding us of that. The battle in Hawaii, again, is primarily about disclosure. That's all we were asking from the county level. That's all we were asking. Tell us what you're doing. Don't tell us trade secrets. Just tell us so we can have informed consent, so we could make our own decisions. And they refused to do it. And we had a caveat also. Disclosure, and don't do this next to schools, hospitals, and houses until we do our due diligence. Just a brief follow-up on Tyrone Hayes. I know Dr. Hayes also very well. And if you're interested in the truth, I encourage you to do an internet search, Tyrone Hayes, New Yorker magazine, and atrazine. And they publish court documents in there to show you how viciously he was targeted. The industry would buy search topics for his name and then have the search go to slanderous articles, that kind of thing. And consequently, it intimidates other scientists from doing the work. If they do work that criticizes the industry, they are immediately attacked, as are politicians and other people. Yes. Thank you.
I think we should tackle the issue of responsibility. Who is really responsible for these severe health implications that we see in the concept of pesticides? The states? The judges? Who wants to answer this one? Probably Tashkut. The UN?
Certainly not the UN.
Why not?
Well, they believe they're immune. I think there's the theory and then there's the reality. The theory is that the corporations are responsible. They have a responsibility for making sure their products are safe, that they're not harming anyone. And then there's the reality. The reality is that it's the victims that bear the burden. They're the ones that live with the disabilities, that develop diseases later on, and shoulder the costs of healthcare, that lose the productivity of their lands and their livelihoods in the long term when the crops that they grow are increasingly resistant to pesticides. So that's my 2 cents.
But in this case, I mean, should it be the governments of states like Hawaii who take responsibility and enforce regulation?
You know, I agree that the executive sitting on the board of directors is who we should hold accountable. They should be paying the price for this. They should be paying the dollar price and the moral price for it as well. And ultimately, that's where we should target our laws, not the little people next door and the small farms, that kind of thing. We should hold our politicians accountable. And I've come to understand the person that is ultimately accountable is you and I. Okay, if we do nothing, if we don't speak out, if we don't lobby our politicians, if we don't elect people who represent clean air and clean water in a worldview that we think people are entitled to with human rights, then we're accountable for that. That's the only way change is going to happen. The only way.
But you've tried to do this together with a lot of people from Hawaii. You haven't been that successful, as far as I understood it. Isn't that really kind of frustrating?
It is frustrating. It is very frustrating, but you can never give up. My friend Paul Acheta from Earth Justice would say, if you give up, you might as well just give them the keys. And I'm not willing to give them the keys. And if you measure the impact in my community today versus what was happening 5 years ago, I am convinced our community is a safer place today as a result of the work of myself and all those 4,000 people marching. Our community is safer. We passed a law, we lost in court, we have not been successful at the state, but the companies, through public pressure, have pushed back from the schools. They no longer spray right next to the school. They've now, DuPont is just investing $12 million in closed structures to do their experiments. And we were demanding that 5 years ago. So as a result of public pressure, people are more educated, these companies are more on their toes, and our community is safer. But we cannot stop. We're committed in Hawaii to identifying, recruiting, and training and supporting new politicians, putting people in public office at the county level and the state level who feel the same urgency we do. And it's not just about pesticides, it's about climate change. It's about economic disparity. There's lots of issues. But we need to elect people, and I encourage you to do the same here. That's what we're focusing on, is electing people who will make a difference and make a change and not just side with the industry every time they have to make a decision.
But as long as there's a strong industry interest around, as long as there's so much money around, do you really think that can be a change, that there can be a new generation of politicians?
I do. I have to think that way, quite frankly. You know, what else is there? What else are we going to do? We have a four-part strategy in Hawaii. We are on the ground. We are marching. We are carrying signs. We are showing up and filling the halls and testifying issues. So we're on the ground. We're in court. We're suing Syngenta. We're suing the state. We're going to keep pressing in court. We are trying to pass laws, and we are trying to elect new politicians. So it's a four-part strategy, and we are committed 100%. And again, we are making a difference. And a lot of it's education. A lot of it's what we're doing right now. So you can go home knowing that what's happening in Hawaii, and to a large extent, Syngenta is a part of it. And I hope we get to talk about it. There's an initiative, I believe, that people in Switzerland are
That's
going
my
to be...
next question to Laurent Gaberell. Yes, we're talking about the Responsible Business Initiative.
Yes.
Well, that might be an alternative. To give you an idea, it's an initiative launched by a broad coalition of civil society organizations. And the idea is, Laurent?
It's basically based on the guiding principle on business and human rights that were developed and adopted at the UN, Human Rights Council, which says that, of course, the state has a duty to protect, but also companies need to respect human rights. And that initiative seeks to now operationalize this concept in Switzerland. What it means exactly is due diligence. So it was quite funny in the campaign, because the campaign on the initiative has already started. Syngenta came out in the news and said that the initiative was about making companies responsible in Switzerland for human rights violation in their supply chain. So basically they said that many litigation would come against companies because someone else in the supply chain violated the human rights, and Syngenta said that. And it's quite ironic because, in fact, Syngenta, of course, we're not talking about its supply chain, we're talking about its own products. And then the other aspect that is ironic is that the initiative is not at all about litigation. It's really about prevention of human rights. And the way you do this is the due diligence mechanism. So all companies would have this due diligence obligation, meaning, one, you assess the human rights risk of your activities, then you act to stop violation of human rights. Third step is that you assess whether what you've done has actually provided a solution to the problem. And fourth, you make that public. So you inform the public about what you've been doing. And if you look at Hawaii, Syngenta has done none of this. At least we don't know if they assessed the risk because they haven't published anything. We don't know what they've been doing to reduce the risk, but what we know is that they sued you because you just wanted to know what kind of pesticides they were spraying, and because you wanted to have buffer zones with schools. And then they didn't make anything public. So in that case, I would clearly say that they were violating their human rights obligation, and that would or could change if the initiative would be adopted in Switzerland, hopefully.
But Syngenta has sold its Hawaii business last year to a US-based company. So would this initiative, if enacted, could help the people in Hawaii?
It doesn't change anything in terms of the due diligence obligation that you have to do, because the due diligence obligation applies whether it's your own activities or whether it's your supplier or someone else in the supply chain. What changes if it's not anymore Syngenta doing the harm there, is that they would not be anymore liable in Switzerland. So in that specific case, you could not bring a civil claim against Syngenta in Switzerland because it's not the company, it's a supplier. And the legal civil responsibility in the case of the initiative applies only for the company or its subsidiary.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it could help?
Well, just briefly,
the other end of the world?
Syngenta globally sold their operations to Kim China. The state of Hawaii, Syngenta sold it to Hartung Brothers. If you read the documents, the source documents when the sale was made, it is actually a subcontractor type of arrangement. Syngenta says clearly, you're buying this, but you're going to continue providing these services for us, doing the same thing. So it's been about a year, I believe. Nothing has changed. It's all the same employees. It's all the same product. And I believe they're doing this work for Syngenta. The land leases underlying the land that they're using is still under the name of Syngenta as well.
Mm-hmm. So it might help. What do you think about this way to solve the problem? Is it promising? Do you have other ideas that could help?
Well, I think the idea of requiring companies to conduct human rights due diligence throughout their operations and their business relationships, including their supply chains, seems pretty much like common sense to me. They should be doing this already. What I've discovered in my conversations with the chemical industry is that compared to other industries, say the extractive industries, the chemical industry, including agrochemicals, is years behind in implementing the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and having human rights due diligence as part of their corporate policies. It's really shocking. A positive example is BASF. I've actually sat down and had the opportunity to hear what they're doing, but when I've met with other companies, zero, nothing. And that's not what we see in other industries. So I think to make these due diligence policies a requirement would be certainly very helpful for the chemical industry.
We have to come to an end with our panel discussion. And the last question probably for Gary, who had the longest way to come over to Switzerland. Do you have any hope that your paradise will not be poisoned anymore in 10 years to come, or is this just impossible?
No, I do have hope. And I think we have to have hope, and we have to have diligence and commitment. And I know the people in my community, the people who are in this movie, will not give up. And we will continue to push and to fight. And in the political arena, and I've spent 18 years or so in that arena, persistence pays off. At the end of the day, it does. Even the politicians who don't believe you want you to go away. And eventually, we will get increased regulation. And every day, we get increased education. Every day, more and more people are buying organic, they're eating, they're paying more attention to that. It's a global phenomenon, and we're part of that phenomenon. I wanted to say, I said earlier that one of the big lies is the feeding the world. And in our community, there's about 10,000 acres that's used for GMO testing, and most of that is corn. And they used to come to me and say, well, if we lose this fields, we're not going to be able to feed the world. And then you start tracking the corn, and you find out none of the corn is meant to feed Hawaii. That's number one. And none of it is meant to feed people. It's cattle feed, it's high fructose corn syrup, and it's ethanol. And you do not feed the world with meat and with high fructose corn syrup. And the industry, and I'm not anti-science, is doing some work around the world on positive uses. But the use that we're talking about here, with corn particularly, it does not feed the world. It is not just the pesticide damage, but the damage to people's health from the high fructose corn syrup and the meat is incredible. But
the issue of food security could be...
yeah, and I want to just add before I'm done...
we could talk about it for hours, I'm sure about that, but we would like to give the audience a chance to ask questions.
And I
can imagine that there are a lot of questions left.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Gary. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Now let's open the panel for questions. You can ask your questions in English or French. We can translate them here. Whom wants to be the first one? Yes, please.
Bonjour, merci.
Yes, good evening, and I'd like to thank you for showing us this film, and I'd like to thank you for the exchange of the panelists. So, I've trained as a scientist, and there's a difference with some is that I never was paid by, any companies or multinationals throughout my life. So what I can see is that, in fact, the film goes to prove, we can say proves, that there is a sort of genocide in Hawaii. I think it could be called genocide. And this genocide, we should be able to initiate legal proceedings against the companies such as Syngenta. And I'm very happy that you talked about this initiative. In fact, there are two initiatives. There is one initiative. And my question is going to be, do you think that that's going to change things? So the first initiative is the Swiss initiative we mentioned, where they require that multinationals be responsible, and we're going to be voting on this in Switzerland. So there's some hope the Federal Council was against saying, oh, well, in any way, we're going to ask companies to be nicer and sweeter with the world. I mean, that is actually rubbish. It doesn't work. You have to actually force them. There has to be coercion. The second initiative within the United Nations, the human rights, that has to do with human rights. This is an initiative that, in fact, is a mandate in which we ask at the UN level. We're asking,
S'il vous plaît, monsieur, pas trop long.
not too long, please. Okay, I'm going to try and keep it short. I can't find the word to have a treaty that has a law-abiding effect and managed by the equator, and this treaty would mean that multinationals can no longer claim impunity. And so these two initiatives together could certainly have as an effect that the multinationals change their attitude. Do you think that there's hope around the initiatives such as these? So who's your question for? Who do you want to address your question to?
Who would like to comment?
Okay, United Nations.
Is it okay if I respond in English? Thanks. So I had the opportunity to participate last year for the first time in the treaty negotiations on transnational corporations, and I think the prevention aspect that Laurent was speaking about, to me, has a great deal of potential. In terms of addressing impunity, I'm not so convinced, but I think to the extent that we can have corporations, no matter where they are, conducting human rights due diligence, in particular on their relationships and their supply chains, I think that would be a very useful step forward.
I think I also already a bit explained what is my view on the Swiss initiative, but I think it can make a great difference. I'm not totally convinced it will solve everything, because at the end of the day, it might get to the point where you discuss whether what Syngenta is doing is enough or not. And that could get very specific and very complex. For example, paraquat, they're doing stuff to reduce risk about paraquat use in the countries. They're claiming they're doing things, for example, by training farmers on the safe use of paraquat, by using labels that clearly explain the dangers and how the pesticide should be used. But what we're saying is that what they're doing does not address the risk enough. So they're not able to reduce and to eliminate a human rights violation. But you quickly go into this direction of discussing with the companies whether what they're doing is enough or not. In my view, maybe one of the major difference that the initiative would make is that they would be at least be obliged to report and to make public what they're doing, their risk assessment, what they're doing, whether it works or not, and then you could have the state or even NGOs or citizens looking into this and raising the issue that what they're doing is not enough, not adequate, and push for more action. So it will be, I think, an ongoing fight, even if we get this due diligence obligation here. On the treaty, of course, I think it's a welcome initiative as well. It will take some more time before we agree on this treaty, because the European Union, even Switzerland, not talking about the US, are all opposing the initiative. So at the end of the day, the risk is that we have a treaty that is not signed by the major countries where the problem is coming from. So that's a risk, but of course this is really an initiative that we could support.
So who wants to be next? Over there? Yeah. Yes, please. Could you introduce yourself, please, at the beginning? No.
Bonsoir.
Good evening.
Je me présente Christophe Bosson.
My name is Christophe Bosson. I'm a farmer and I live and work in Geneva. I was asked if I use phytosanitary products, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own philosophy. After this debate, it's going to prove somewhat complicated, but let's have a go. So I like what I do, and which has a very close relation to the earth. This is very important for me, and I have to produce plants and vegetables to feed animals and human beings, and I have to produce them in the best possible way. So it's not because we're working organic that we're not going to intervene. So personally, I do vineyards with organic, and I still have to use sulfur and copper. And there are pesticides that are used that can be used in a organic way. It's not because in nature. Again, it's not the Rousseau type of philosophy in that man has perverted everything. So we have to find the right balance between the earth, the climate. Not too long, please. There are other people who would like to ask questions. And I just want to say to you that the Geneva farming is very dynamic, and I associate different plants, and farmers hate treating, and that's the last recourse. And all the technical profile of products, we do everything we can to avoid treatment. It's when you've tried everything else. I'd like to finish that the wheat I grow, I don't use fungicides for the last 25 years because we have state-run studies, and so there are actually wheat varieties that resist. So it's totally dismantled by the politicians who are going to put it in the hands of private companies. So what is your question, sir? So I was asked to speak up. There's no question. And this is just a testimonial, and this loss of again, the state giving in to the private companies is going to be a disaster for Swiss farming.
So I think we have time for last questions. Please try to keep it short.
English or French?
Like you want.
Okay. My name is Pierre Pradaban. I've been fighting for over 50 years for a world that works for all, a win-win world that works for all. As my question is for the gentleman on my left, I have to say that I have a scientific training up to the doctoral level, and you mentioned that the film wasn't credible because it didn't really demonstrate scientifically what it said. For me, that is not the issue. This is a very hackneyed argument that people use today to say that science is the only form of truth. No, science is one small approach to reality. What we are looking for is not a scientific proof, absolute, iron-hard proof that pesticides are not harming people is in Hawaii. What we are looking for is human happiness. In Hawaii, many people are suffering from this use of pesticides. So what is the most important? That we fight for human happiness and for balanced lives when it seems evident there are major unproven dangers, or that we go with a very narrow science which wants to prove anything which it can never do.
So the question, you would like to answer?
I understood his point, and I absolutely agree. We're at a human rights film festival. Last week was International Women's Day. Let's keep in mind the positive aspects of agriculture. We absolutely are going to have people starving everywhere if we abandon agriculture. I grew up on an organic farm. It's absolutely the reason I went to college, was to not have to farm, because it is a very difficult life. And if we go worldwide, we're all very fortunate to be here, but if we go worldwide into developing nations, the burden of agriculture, the hard labor that it is, falls primarily on women and women of color. And last week at International Women's Day, it didn't get a lot of traction, but the reality is modern agriculture has extended the lives of women in developing nations by 12 years, because they're no longer forced to use the short hose and this back-breaking labor. Subsistence farming is very, very difficult, and it's hard for most of us. We're, as he said, we're in sort of a postmodern world where we can create an idyll about what agriculture could be, but we're living in a modern economy, and these people are not. So let's recognize that if we're going to think about human rights, let's not just demonize companies. Let's think about the human rights benefits that modern science and technology have brought.
Was that an argumentation pro-pesticides, pro-industrialized agriculture? Did I get that right?
I'm very much a fan of science and technology. It's obvious from me being here and wanting to come here in what I knew would be a hostile environment to try and get that out, right? To make this point again that the modern world is not all bad. We don't drive a car 5 miles per hour, even though we know we could save hundreds of thousands of lives each year if we just set the speed limit at 5 miles an hour. We didn't stop developing cellular phones because of a typewriter, and it worked just fine. And it's the same thing with agriculture. We've improved in many ways. When I was a child, we were in the middle of a population bomb. There was going to be mass starvation. Science and technology fixed that to a point where now, today, for the first generation in the history of planet Earth, the poorest people can afford to be fat. And this is so important to understand that we've created a world where poor
We just learned a
people-
lot about, on this panel, hopefully, about the side effects, the negative side effects of modern agriculture. I think we shouldn't minimize it, probably.
The problem is the cost of this. And there's one recent study that looked at the US, and it seems that pesticides, in general, the hidden cost of pesticides is 50 billion a year. Because when you take into account all the regulation costs, all the risk assessment costs, and then all the environmental costs, human health costs, then you get to 50 billions a year of costs. And
Okay, but are you in
more.
favor of hunger?
That's more than the benefits.
This is
How about organic farming? I mean, you know the issue, obviously, from your family.
I think there's hundreds of examples. This Mr. was just explaining how it's possible today to reduce pesticides use without losing yields.
well, we're doing that
while
with BT
keeping
corn,
exactly the
right?
same
BT
level.
corn is a perfect example of how pesticide use plummeted.
I think, sorry
BT
about that.
corn
I think
is
we
a
have,
negative
we have
in
to
science,
to come to an end.
but
We
organic
tackled a lot of
farmers
issues
spray
here.
BT on their crops.
And I think we all do agree that it's a highly controversial issue.
Actually-
and that there are a
actually-
lot of open questions. Do we have time for a last one? Yes? Okay, last one. Last comment, Gary.
Okay, I was going to say, I don't agree that there's any question about whether or not things are harmful or whether or not we should be following this path. That it's absolutely clear to me that the harm that's caused by industrial agriculture, in my community firsthand, it's absolutely clear. You know, we have this evidence, and I appreciate the question from the gentleman down here, because the industry pulls us down this science rabbit hole that you'll never ever find, and we mentioned this before about causation, you'll never find proof, absolute proof, that this chemical over here caused this little boy's cancer over here. You know that little boy has cancer, you know these chemicals cause cancer, but to actually prove that that happened over there, we don't have to prove that. All we have to do is be concerned enough to protect that little boy and that community, and buffer zones and disclosure. Remember that. All we're asking for is tell us what you're doing, and don't do it next to that little boy. Thank you.
So thank you to all of us. Thanks for this lively debate. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you had an interesting evening and something to think about at home. So have a great evening. Thank you. A great night. Bye-bye.